Therapy offers practical and supportive ways to manage stress and other difficult parts of your everyday life. When it comes to fear, people can look at therapy, which can help you understand what you're feeling, why, and how to cope. I was able to visit with my therapist, Tim Riley, a psychologist at Midwest Behavioral Health. His work specializes with anxiety disorders here in Lincoln, Nebraska. Awesome. Okay, in your professional opinion, what would you define fear as?
Fear is a cognitive interpretation of a nervous system event. So somebody gets stimulated by something, and their interpretation is that that something represents some threat to life, limb, or body. So it's not that you run into the woods and you're afraid, you see a bear and you're afraid and you run. It's you run into the woods, you run, and then you're afraid. So it's the interpretation of the event.
Why do you think humans have like fears?
Because it's good to remind you to stay away from places where there are bears.
Okay. So do you believe that fear is triggered by trauma and personal experiences or other individual experiences?
Can be, but not necessarily. I mean, we have sort of a built-in fear response. So we tend to startle and have big neurophysiological reactions to sudden changes in our environment. Things that don't change very much, we're not afraid of, we get used to them. But when there's a sudden change, so a loud noise, a mouse runs out from under the couch, whatever, something about our environment changes, we're built to respond to those stimuli. And if our reaction is suggestive of some threat, which could be based on history, but not necessarily, then we feel afraid.
Mhm. Is the discussion fear an often topic you hear with
Yeah,
your
I'm sorry,
clients?
say again.
Is the discussion fear an often like topic you hear with your clients?
Oh, not more than a few times every day.
Okay. What do you believe to be the most common fear among students in their 20s?
So, actually did a little bit of research, and kind of what I settled on is the three F's: friends, finances, and failure. And sort of depends on where you are in the process. If you're new to campus and you don't have a group of friends there already, then there seem to be a lot of fears or at least anxiety around social issues. If you're more settled in your social environment, then it's failure. Either I picked the wrong major, am I doing the right thing, or I'm going to fail this individual class. And at least for a significant percentage, finances. So the three F's.
This might be just like an obvious answer, but is going to therapy and talking about your fears a beneficial way to help overcome them? And if so, like why?
Nah, it's a complete waste of time. Yeah. I mean, I like to think it's a beneficial thing. Otherwise, I probably shouldn't have the job I do. Um, and it's beneficial, and it's kind of a big question for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is sometimes people are reluctant to share their fears because they think it makes them look weak, or might cause other people to judge them or whatever. So, getting into therapy where you can understand better why unreasonable fears develop, and recognizing that that's a normal process, if not necessarily a productive outcome, is helpful to a lot of people.
Do you think that fear is causing heightened anxiety for college students?
Sure. So if you think
Okay.
about, yeah, I mean, fear is kind of a reaction to current stressors or stressors in the immediate past. So you go into the
Hmm.
woods, run, you see a bear, you run, you're afraid. But then the next time you start thinking about going back to those woods, you experience a recurrence of that fear. You begin to anticipate the fear. So that's really what anxiety is fear of a future stressor or future threatening event that reaches back into the present and changes how you think and behave in the present moment. So if your experience on campus from the first day was, I feel really uncomfortable here, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know anybody, feeling sort of edgy, whatever, then the next time you're on campus, your brain, doing what brains do, remembers that for you and tells you, yeah, this isn't a safe place to be, or this class is bad because you got a bad grade in here, or whatever it is. So yes, short answer, yes, past experiences affect future fear.
What are some day-to-day things you can do to help relieve some of the pent-up stress you have due to particular fears?
Well, with respect to particular fears, there's really only one way that you can get by them, and that is by engaging with whatever the feared thing is. So if you're afraid of a particular class, then you need to go into that class. If you're afraid to walk on a particular, I mean, this is assuming there's no rational basis for the fear. If you're afraid of, speaking in public, you need to speak more in public. If you're afraid of, tap dancing in public, then you need to tap dance more in public. The reality is that you can't ever get better at doing something by not doing it. And fear always makes us want to avoid whatever the feared thing is, which is a good idea if it's an actual bear. But if it's just our exaggerated impression of a potential bear somewhere that probably doesn't really exist, then the best thing to do is go into the woods.
Because some of the things that I like struggle with and things like that. If it takes more time as far as like not being able to just put yourself into the situation right away, what are things like you can work on like day to day as far as like coping, or like are there things to like de-stress yourself, like other activities, or like
Yeah,
um
it's really kind of two different questions. One question is, how do you deal with particular fears? And
mhm,
there's no way around that really other than engaging with the feared thing. But the other
mhm,
question is, are there ways to make myself less reactive to fear or stress in general? And the answer to that is sure. Um, so, from my perspective, the two most important things for dealing with stress in general are learning how to regulate yourself physiologically, learning how to regulate your nervous system, particularly your autonomic nervous system. So that's doing things like paced breathing or aerobic exercise is useful for that purpose. Then, in terms of thought-based or cognitive-based responses to fear, doing some kind of meditative or mindfulness practice. And then there's a whole list of other things you can do that are research supported in terms of these are things that if you do them, we have both objective and subjective evidence to suggest they will improve your ability to tolerate stress. So that's volunteering, yoga, going outside, any kind of exercise, both aerobic and weight bearing exercise, religious practice. Diet has a lot to do with it. Improving your sleep habits has a lot to do with it. Um, that's the short list.
and so you talked about towards the end, like of the questions that I gave to you before,
Mhm.
um, about how overcoming a fear is like the wrong approach. Do you want to explain why
So,
that's
yeah, I mean, maybe overcoming is not exactly the right idea, but the idea of you need to somehow beat back your emotions or control your emotions or fight back against fear is
mhm,
wrong, because you don't get to decide what you feel. And if you set yourself up to do battle with something that you really can't control, then for a lot of people, that ends up leaving them disappointed. And when they get disappointed, they feel less in control and end up feeling more anxious. But to be able to say, if I'm going toward the woods and I've encountered a bear there before, I expect to be uncomfortable and I can live with that discomfort. I'm willing to live with that discomfort, but I'm going to behave in a way that's important to me from a value standpoint or a thought standpoint. If you say, I'm going to react to my life, I'm going to build my life around the way I feel, then you might just as well say, I'm going to build my life around the weather or the tide or, astrology, some other thing that I can't control. And that ends up, for the most part, leaving people feeling less confident, less competent about dealing with their life, having less of a sense of agency, and at the end of the day, probably more anxious rather than less.
Last question. What do you think is the best way to go about dealing with your biggest fears?
I think we already talked about it to some degree. I mean, you don't necessarily, you know, whatever your biggest fear is, you think of that as being like, a tank full of man-eating sharks. I mean, and so you don't need to go and jump into the tank to get over your fear, but you might go and look at some sharks in the tank. You might read about sharks. You might desensitize yourself to a certain extent. Sharks. So, for example, patients I've had with, phobias about dogs, we start by looking at pictures of dogs, and I can see them react physically to that. So I help them learn how to calm down in the presence of that picture of a dog. And when they can do that, then I show them a picture of multiple dogs or a meaner looking dog, and gradually go through that process, which is referred to as systematic desensitization, until they can be calm in the presence of closer and closer approximation of the real thing. And then eventually I bring in a real dog, and they have practiced bit by bit, step by step, learning how to deal with first the idea of a dog, which to humans is just as strong as the dog itself, and then eventually the actual stimulus. So, except in really rare occasions, it's not a great idea to, for example, if you're afraid of a dog, have someone throw you in a room full of Doberman pinschers and lock the door. You would get over it, but it wouldn't be very much fun. So the idea is to start in a way that feels manageable or almost manageable to you, and then gradually work your way up to the actual stimulus.
Sweet.
I sound like a
Well,
professor.
thank you.
Awful.
Thank you.
All right. It's a pleasure. All right. See you later.